Issue 38. It starts out with Tails having stilted dialogue where he reminds Antoine that he and him are on a scouting mission to report on Robotropolis' condition after the earthquake. He shouldn't even be saying this in universe since he's telling him something he already knows, all to tell the audience what they're doing. There must have been a more natural way of doing this. I do like how the story follows up on the previous one though, although it just makes the super magical billionth ring being ignored all the more glaring. As I was thinking the comics were becoming more episodic recently, and that's why. Anyways, why does Sally need them to do this anyways? It should be obvious that the earthquake left Robotropolis in ruins. Sonic runs around listening to a tune in his head that's the theme song to one of the old Sonic TV shows, I'm guessing Sad AM. Something that would be a perfectly acceptable reference in universe if he hadn't had the line, "Wonder where I've heard it before." Which breaks the immersion as you wonder how he could have heard it in universe just to forget its origin. It would have been fine if it was a tune he himself made up about himself from egoism. That would have made sense in universe. Instead, this comes off as very forced and an unnecessary shilling of another continuity. Sonic calls Antoine a fraidy fox instead of a fraidy cat, which is confusing since Tails is there and Antoine's not a fox like him, so where'd that line change come from? Antoine points out that a SWAT is there in fear, and immediately Tails has to grab Antoine and helpfully fly him out of danger while Sonic avoids a bunch of robots, including combots, which makes sense and yet doesn't at the same time. It makes sense that invincible robots would survive falling off a cliff, but it doesn't make sense that Eggman hadn't sent them against Knothole and instead kept them in Robotropolis' ruins. Not to mention these are overpowered foes for Sonic to face if they're really invincible, which they're not. Antoine sure is lucky that Tails dropping him on a robot didn't injure him, considering he landed on metal from a high distance. But somehow this helped Sonic quite a bit. Still, that was pretty mean of him. It's not like Tails even has anything really against Antoine like Sonic does. Eventually, one of the combots gets destroyed by lightning. About time, since robots conduct electricity. This really should have happened a lot more often. But the explosion from that thing knocks Sonic out for a while. And considering how many times explosions happen right next to characters and they survive without a scratch, this is annoyingly inconsistent. I mean, Sally and Jeffrey didn't get hurt from being really close to an explosion, so why does Sonic get hurt? At least Antoine has the decency to be worried about him being hurt by an exploding robot. I'm sure the same will be afforded to him because of it. When Sally comes back with all the other freedom fighters, Sonic runs into a wall because he's feeling dizzy still, and then there's an interesting plot point introduced with an extremely stupid origin. He's lost his speed temporarily, but not from one of Eggman's devices, not from a magic spell. No, instead we're expected to believe that he lost his speed from being hit by an exploding from lightning robot earlier. Even though he was holding a ring at the time, which should have by definition made him invulnerable to the attack. And they even have the nerve to try to justify this with garbage technobabble. If this loss of speed had come from something logical, I would be interested. But instead it's just enragingly arbitrary, makes me wish it was already over, especially since it contradicts one of the rules established by the lore, that magic rings protect you. Sonic is still pretty stressed out from losing his greatest asset. Possibly to the point where he thinks that he's worthless without it, who knows. But his lashing out at Rotor was still pretty mean-spirited of him, even with those circumstances, since he basically implied that if he was too smart, he'd magically become evil and dangerous like Robotnik, just because Robotnik and Rotor are both gadgeteer geniuses. Maybe this comes from deep down resentment of his intelligence and what he has in common with Eggman. I can imagine this would be a pretty sore spot for Rotor, source of insecurity for him. Shame, but he just shrugs it off. I like that Sally sticks up for him though, and is quickly left to drop instead of making the story even more tedious by requiring Sonic to make it up to Rotor for being stressed out. Fortunately, Nicole makes the suggestion that getting enough magical rings could restore Sonic's speed. I'm glad she says, in theory, and may, rather than inexplicably knowing it for an absolute certainty as if she read the script ahead of time. Instead, she sounds more like an actual character, in-universe, making an educated guess, which is much less overpowered and cheap. It's smart of her to come to this conclusion, and in a reasonable kind of smart because it makes sense she'd think of this. But the mentioning of magic rings just makes the fact that he was inconvenienced by an explosion while holding one even more glaring. Sonic's backhanded compliment of her response is confusing, confirming that he still has a rivalry with her that, for all we know, is only because she shocked him that one time. Even though in the very story this is a continuation of, Sonic showed respect for her by giving her an award. And now he's acting like he's respecting her for the first time again. By the way, why doesn't this mentioning of rings remind Sonic of the super powerful billionth ring he mounted on his wall? Why doesn't he use it as a check of his guns to get his speed back? But because there'd be no story? They should have had this story take place before he'd already gotten that ring then. Maybe it does. Maybe this and the previous story chronologically take place before Sonic got the billionth ring. And the Zone of Silence story too, because it makes zero sense for him to have not used it in there instead of the dangerous device he didn't want to use, Megman. Unfortunately, the Freedom Fighters get attacked in an ambush by Combots who, in a clever reference to Dulcie's mistake earlier, actually are invisible. So either these particular Combots are invisible instead of practically invincible, explaining why Sonic is able to beat them, or the Combots all had the cloaking device ability all along and just never used it until now, making Dulcie accidentally right. I mean, it makes sense that he would install one just in case. Bunny attacks one of the robots with a super strength robot arm, reminding me that things may not be hopeless because she's the most competent freedom fighter aside from Sonic and she's being allowed to be useful now. Are things gonna turn south immediately anyways? Yep, because Bunny's never allowed to have a story where she's the main one being useful. No, it could have been nice, but oh well. Predictably, the Freedom Fighters get captured, again, with Sonic being spared because after throwing a power ring into a robot, it exploded and knocked him out into the water, forcing one of Sally's old trainees to save him. Let me guess, he got his speed back because he replicated the situation that made him lose it. Well, no, it doesn't seem like it. So the rules aren't even consistent in the story. All the backup Freedom Fighters show up, still with no personalities. And Sonic mentions that he thinks the legendary Lake of Rings have been found accidentally, but that's immediately dropped underwhelmingly instead of Sonic taking advantage of it to get his speed back. A scary looking Flymobian that looks like an invading alien race, which is pretty out of place to be honest, tells them that in his spy network, his agents have revealed that Robotnik's got Sally and the others imprisoned in a secondary lab. Well, it's a good thing they were able to figure that out that fast. Robotropolis hasn't been completely safeguarded again after the earthquake, and the attack's blow explains Snively had actually short-circuited its convenient force field with his earlier screw-up, which wasn't made that clear last time. I thought it had only damaged the hovercraft. Because the convenient force field is down, they can enter the lab through an air shaft. Then he buzzes. That must be an annoying speech impediment for Flymobians to have to deal with. But to get to the shaft, they'll have to travel along a narrow maintenance pathway. I really like how it's justified that they know this information by Uncle Chuck serving as a spy, providing them with the data they need to know, rather than it feeling completely arbitrary that they all know this. I also like how the person saying this is the dog who wrote graffiti messages disguised as SWATbot earlier on, proving that he survived the earthquake, and a lot of other people probably did too. Sonic then thinks that for the first time without Sonic speed, he's worried, which is bullshit because he was obviously worried earlier when he first discovered he had lost his speed. So that was a stupid line. Sonic's life gets saved and he immediately shouts at the person instead of thanking them. Wow, that was dickish. 2 times he was uncharacteristically rude in the same story, and with only added stress over losing his greatest asset as a thin justification. Even the pig guy wasn't this bad. Because while Hamlin never showed gratitude to Jeffrey for saving his life, at least it was explained earlier that he was in a feud with him and didn't trust him, while Sonic hating Porky instead of thanking him comes out of nowhere. Also, it's weird that he's calling him Porky and not the pig. It's good that Sonic gets called out on being a jerk, but he never apologizes this time. He never explains himself or says thank you, instead of changing the subject by saying they've reached their destination and have to take it easy and keep quiet. Through a diabolus ex machina, Eggman and Snively magically are right there with an army of Combots, and it's revealed that they already know Sonic lost his speed. It took a while for me to figure out that he meant Snively tortured the Freedom Fighters into revealing the truth, with persuasive methods. For a while I was really confused about how he'd know this. I can understand he detects Sonic, because he's shown he has non-robotic life detectors earlier. Sonic reveals in his worried and thus sympathetic thoughts that the Lake of Rings can only produce one ring per day. Oh, so that's why it was dropped anticlimactically. He couldn't just stand there and wait for a whole bunch of rings to show up to power him up. He gets to be overpowered otherwise. Sonic remembers that he has another ring in his backpack that he kept with him all this time for some reason. That was convenient, but he immediately needs just one more ring, and predictably he gets it right away. The other ring that he lost during his battle at the lake. Why is that here? This returns him to super speed, giving his attacks the force needed to win effortlessly. Robotnik does the non-stupid thing for once by setting a timed bomb off so that they won't be able to use his technology and force them to leave. But his line justifying it is pretty annoying. He's obviously giving it a timer so that he'll have enough time to leave the place before it'll blow up on him. But he phrases it as him being a good sport when he's portrayed as being obviously evil, making him not the type who would proudly give them a fighting chance. Oh, and there's a backup story that's really pointless, because almost nothing happens in-universe. Sonic gets sick, and Tails reads a fictional comic book made about the Freedom Fighters being space fighters, and Sonic hates it, for what I can only assume is because he doesn't like reading what's essentially alternate universe fanfiction about people he actually knows in real life. Self-insert fanfiction at that. Sally's outfit and long hair here reminds me of the outfit that the anti-Sally would wear much later on. Sonic once questions why the heroes survived their crash, and Tails has to tell him that he's supposed to take these things in good faith, as in don't try to think logically about it. This is a weird role reversal, since it'd make more sense for Sonic the carefree hedgehog to be the one telling this to Tails, who'd be questioning a story thanks to being logical and intelligent. And it's also annoying because it comes off as the writers of the comic book telling you that you're not allowed to question the faulty logic and plot holes of the comic book purely because it's of the sci-fi fantasy genre, using Sonic as a strawman and Tails as the mouthpiece. I kind of found the reinterpretation of Eggman interesting, by having his main goal being eating everything on the planet. Him having such an appetite actually makes use of all the fat jokes surrounding him that were fortunately made less frequent over time from their lack of funniness. Still, this plot is wasted on a comic book that's fictional in universe. Not that it made sense anyways, unless this version of Eggman is able to properly digest literally anything, and has an insatiable appetite that he didn't think to develop a cure for. And then Tails gets sick, and Sonic gets his revenge by reading a fictional comic book to him. It's a pretty simple story, but it's overwhelmed by feeling so pointless throughout because you know it's just a story about a fictional story being read, meaning that nothing's really happening in-universe. I'm surprised they had multiple paragraphs to say about it. I guess it does work as downtime though, by showing you that Sonic and Tails care about each other enough to take care of each other when they're sick. It's also continuing off the plot point introduced in 2 earlier issues that there are actually comic books in-universe based off the Freedom Fighters that the Freedom Fighters themselves make, which we can only presume is for boosting morale and not whole by giving them pro-Freedom Fighter propaganda. I like the concept, it makes sense, but them being made by the Freedom Fighters themselves comes off a little bit self-indulgent for them, like self-insert fanfiction. Although it's better than one of them overreacting and complaining because the fictional version of them was written by someone else in a way they didn't like. I could easily imagine Sally doing that. The first story was written by Kent Taylor, a new writer once again, and it was a frustrating story that couldn't wait to be over because Sonic's loss of speed felt completely arbitrary. It would have been fine if he had been given slow shoes, like in a reference to Sonic Labyrinth. In fact, this would have been the perfect time for a Sonic Labyrinth adaptation. But instead is lost in the most contrived way possible, and breaks a previously established rule in the lore because Sonic had gotten knocked out by an explosion instead protected from it by the magic ring. I do like how Sally's old trainees got to be useful again though, having their spy network thanks to Uncle Chuck's data, letting Sonic find out where to go next, even if they were helpless against the robots in the actual fight. And it's good that Tails is allowed to fly around in a scouting mission and save Antoine with his flight. Although that scouting mission seemed so pointless at first because it wasn't explained how much time had passed after the earthquake destroyed Robotropolis. So I had assumed it was all in ruins, and that they wouldn't need to go there to confirm that, yep, it's destroyed alright. But instead it takes place long after, when it's been rebuilt. I guess it's way too early in the comic for Robotropolis to be truly permanently destroyed, but then they shouldn't have named a story The Fall of Robotropolis. In Bedtime Tales, a story with a name that made me assume it was yet another Telltales of Bedtime story and didn't give me high hopes, was by Mike Kantorovich and Ken Penders. And again, it's completely pointless. Being about a fictional parody of the Freedom Fighters made it all more gratingly pointless because even the person being read the parodies to was annoyed by it. But in general, I didn't really care for this issue. The first story was contrived, not to mention it had Sonic be uncharacteristically rude to his friends, and the second felt like a waste of time, which made it even more annoying for me that once again I had to actively hunt it down just for it to be revealed that it wasn't even worth it.